Now, if you love portrait mode on your phone, but you don't feel like you're getting that same background blur when you're using your real camera, then this is probably the lens for you. And portrait mode on your phone is just a digitally manipulated mode that attempts to imitate what this lens gets you straight out of camera. So your phone is actually trying to identify what's supposed to be in the background and maybe what's supposed to be in the foreground, and then it tries to blur it out in a way that looks somewhat natural. And it's really trying to make that image look like the image coming from this lens or a lens similar to this lens. And the Viltrox 56mm f1.4 has been my recommended portrait lens or lens for sort of video portraits or any time that you really want your subject to be sharp and in focus and detailed and you want your background to be blown out and blurry. This is really an easy way to get a photograph that looks like it was taken by a professional photographer. It's also an easy way to compose a moving image because it clearly identifies and defines the subject. So no matter where you sort of shift that subject in the frame, whether it's in the middle or if it's just off to the third to the right to get kind of a documentary feel, the fact that your subject is sharp and in focus and the background is blurry is something that we're very familiar with from sort of documentary filmmaking or professional photography. So just putting this lens on your camera to start with is going to make your photos and videos look better. It's going to make your photos and videos look more professional. And in addition to the incredible image quality you're going to get out of this lens, it is an incredibly well-built lens. This is an all-metal lens. It has a metal lens hood, has a polished metal mount. Everything about this, when you take it out of the box and put it on your camera and in use, lets you know that you've bought a very high-quality product. And although the lens is an all-metal build, it's not super heavy. It's not too heavy for today's modern mirrorless cameras. It just balances really well and it feels really nice, even on some of the smaller APS-C sensor bodies. Now, this is an autofocus lens, but it does have a manual focus ring if you do want to manual focus things, which particularly when you're getting that really shallow depth of field, sometimes it is nice to just tune it in. So maybe you're just focused on the eyes, and by the time you get to the ears of the person's face, that it's blurry. The manual focus ring does allow you to really tune your focus if you want to use manual focus. And it operates really, really smoothly, every bit as good as my Fuji or Canon or Sony lenses. The other thing that's kind of unique about this lens is it actually has the aperture ring where you can change the aperture on the actual lens itself. So it's got markings from 1.4 all the way up to 16mm. But if you just want to leave it in automatic mode, or if you want to let your camera make the decision about the aperture like you normally would, or even change the aperture in your camera instead of on the lens ring, all you've got to do is turn it to that A automatic mode, and then that turns it back over to your camera. And one of the really cool things that this allows you to do is in camera systems like the Canon system that I use, that doesn't allow you to shoot video in aperture priority mode, by putting the aperture control on the ring on the lens, it allows me to shoot aperture priority video. That means I can put this at f1.4 on the lens itself. I know that I'm going to get a blurry background, and I can tell the camera to make all the other decisions as far as the shutter speed and ISO value. That means that I'm not, normally with my Canon camera, I would have to set all of those different values manually to be able to use that f1.4. There's no ability to use f1.4 and then leave everything else automatic. This allows you to do that. Now, there's a few people out there that actually haven't heard of Viltrox. Now, Viltrox has been around for a few years. They've made a number of lenses now, and they are becoming more and more popular. And really, they are sort of the go-to company if you want a very high quality image, but you want the lowest possible price in an autofocus lens, you buy Viltrox lenses. And there are people out there shooting film work, professional video. People are shooting commercial projects with Viltrox lenses now. They are honestly that good, and they are also that reliable. The other thing about Viltrox is they're very good at updating their firmware on their lenses, particularly if a camera company releases a new camera. And I used to have a Tamron lens and I eventually sold it. And this lens had the firmware or updates built into it. There was no way for me to update that firmware. And anytime a new camera was released for the system, I had to send it back to Tamron for them to update the firmware. It was just a ridiculous process. Now, here's Viltrox, a budget-friendly, affordable lens company, and just on the bottom of the mount, they have put a little port. This is a micro USB port. This allows you to plug this lens into your computer and update the firmware. And this comes into effect if there's ever a bug that they find in the software that operates on the lens, or potentially when they release new cameras or new firmware for the cameras that could potentially cause a conflict or maybe not work as well with the lens. Viltrox will come out and update that. So you can just plug this into your computer and update your firmware. This is pretty forward thinking, and this just gives you an idea of the quality that Viltrox is trying to produce and the fact that they do stand behind their lenses and their product. Now, the Viltrox 56mm f1.4 is available on Canon EFM mount, Sony E mount, Nikon Z mount now, and Fuji X mount. And when it comes to all those systems, I definitely know on the Canon system and the Sony system, the autofocus and the way that the lens talks to the camera is just like a native lens. You would have no idea that you're using a third-party lens. It works exactly like it would if it was a factory Sony or Canon lens. And I have found the price on this lens has been varying significantly. So in the description down below, I will put a link to the Sony model, Canon model, Nikon model, and Fuji model. And that will take you straight through to a number of suppliers so you can instantly price check from a few of the top suppliers and make sure you're getting the best deal from whichever supplier has that deal at the time. Now, I will also put a link to my recommended UV protective filter for the lens. You'll often hear people that think that UV filters affect image quality. Somebody who thinks that has never spent the time shooting them side by side. I have shot side by side with the filter that I'm recommending, which is like the most affordable, high quality filter I have found that you can get. And when it's on or off in a blind comparison, you absolutely can't tell the difference. Now, one of the first things anybody wants to know when we talk about lenses is how sharp is it? And the answer is extremely sharp, and sharper in the middle than on the edges. But having said that, some of the highest quality lenses are even the highest price lenses. For example, I've got a Fujifilm 56mm f1.2, and that's like $1,000 lens or something like that. That is actually soft at the corners at f1.4 as well. I find the image quality as far as sharpness on this is on par with any of the major manufacturers. And essentially what you get from that is at f1.4, it's very sharp in the middle, but can be a little bit softer at the corners, which is absolutely fine when you're doing sort of portrait photography and you're putting the person in the center of a frame or sort of roughly in the center of frame. You're not going to get any softness affecting that image quality. And if you do need corner to corner sharpness, you just stop down to f2.8, and that will give you sort of image-wide sharpness. But really, the biggest reason that I recommend this lens is the overall image quality, and it's not just the sharpness, it is the background blur. That is the thing that always jumps out to me about this lens. When you are taking portraits or when you are taking photos or videos and a large portion of the frame is going to be blurry because you're trying to draw someone's attention to the subject in the center of the frame or wherever they are in the frame, it is really important that that background blurry area is smooth and beautiful. And something that I found with a lot of modern lenses nowadays is they're trying to get them sharper and sharper and sharper. And when they do that, often, yes, they get super high contrast, super sharp lenses, but that background blur can become busy and distracting and not smooth and beautiful. And actually, when you are looking at an image that has a blurry background, often the fact is most of the image is out of focus. Only a small amount of the image is in focus. So it is really critical that that background blur is sort of creamy and beautiful and just forms a really nice backdrop for what is sharp and in focus in the scene. And even though people don't generally look at the background blur to try to figure out whether it looks good or not, the fact is when you look at an image and it has kind of a jagged or busy background blur, it just isn't as pleasing. It just doesn't look as good, and often you won't even know why. So I think that's really critical. When you're looking at a few of these different lenses, if you're looking for a portrait style lens, don't just look at sharpness. Look at background blur and look at the quality of the way that the blurry backgrounds are rendered. That is super, super important. And for me, that is the one place that this lens actually stands out above pretty much any other lens, even the far more expensive lenses that I've got in my collection. Now, the Viltrox 56mm f1.4 is the cheapest, high-quality, autofocus portrait lens that I know about. And in many ways, what this lens is all about is what this channel is all about, which is getting the best in photo and video with the gear that you can afford or the gear that you already have. So if that is something you're into, be sure to subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to hit that bell notification.